So I'd like to welcome everyone to this evening's program. My name is Ned Bowman, and I am the Outreach Coordinator with the Great Basin Bird Observatory, GBBO, not to be confused with the Great British Bake Off. We are a research group based in Reno, Nevada, dedicated to furthering bird conservation through partnerships, research, and education. If you're not familiar with us, you can check us out on our website at gbbo.org to learn about our research, other programs, community science, and training opportunities. If you're local, you can check out upcoming bird walks on our events calendar. And so tonight's event fits into our winter lecture series. You can find recordings of previous presentations on our YouTube channel, where we are Great Basin Bird Observatory. The next installment will be April 17th by Carl Lundblad, talking about pinyon jay habitat selection and pinyon juniper woodland management. There's more details about that on our events calendar. But tonight's event is about the Intermountain West Shorebird Survey, the IMWSS. GBBO has been participating in and supporting the IMWSS since 2022. For those of you that may not be familiar, this is a volunteer community science effort taking place across the entire Western US, revisiting shorebird surveys that took place about 30 years ago. Max and Blake are going to be introducing this in much more detail shortly, so I won't say too much more about it here, but advancing community science is a big priority of us here at GBBO, and we want to offer this as an opportunity to learn about the importance of this work and hopefully encourage some of you to get involved. So tonight, IMWSS coordinators Blake Barbaree with Point Blue Conservation Science and Max Malmquist with National Audubon are going to be giving us an update on the program. And following their presentation, Lauren Whitenack, a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Reno, and vice president of the National Audubon Society, will be leading an identification workshop on some of the expected shorebird species in the Western US. And so tonight's event will be recorded and published on our YouTube channel and as well as the IMWSS website. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can put them into the chat and/or Q&A. We're going to pause for questions after Blake and Max talk about the program, and then we'll pause for questions again after Lauren finishes her ID section. So without further ado, I am going to shut up and turn it over to Blake and Max. So thanks, guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Ned, and everyone there in person and online. I'm Blake Barbaree. I'm a senior ecologist with Point Blue Conservation Science. And just briefly about Point Blue, we're a nonprofit that is based in Marin and Sonoma counties in California primarily. I personally live in Tucson, so we have folks spread out across the West doing work. We were actually founded 60 years ago this week as Point Reyes Bird Observatory. So we're hitting our 60-year anniversary, and we're continuing to just work to develop nature-based solutions to climate change, habitat loss, and other environmental threats to benefit both us as people and humans and the wildlife and ecosystems around us. I'd encourage you to go to our website at www.pointblue.org to learn more. And this, I'm super excited to talk to you all and about this project. So as it's something that dates back in history, as Ned mentioned, and now we're revisiting some science that was done not quite 60 years ago, but close to that by some of my predecessors in our wetland ecology lab. So if you don't mind, go ahead and next slide. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about just migratory shorebirds, their current status, one of the reasons why we kicked off this project. But as you know, as migratory shorebirds are really using landscapes at vast scales. And so they're really these sentinels of environmental change. They will find habitat when it's created or lost, or when it's created, when it's gone and it's not there, it potentially has big impacts on their health. And we see shorebirds also as these indicators of ecosystem health at multiple different spatial scales. We know at this big scale, they can tell us the health of the wetland networks, which are what these animals have evolved to rely on, and their annual cycle relies on these networks of wetlands. So they can tell us how the network is doing as a whole, but they'll also tell you a lot about the individual site and which individual species are theirs. Many of you probably know at least some about birds, tell you a lot about that local ecosystem. Both the numbers of birds that are there, but also really the diversity that's there as well can tell you a lot about the ecosystem and the types of food that might be available to birds there. So next slide. And many of you probably have seen, not everyone, about 5-6 years ago, the headlines made, 3 billion birds lost in 50 years. And this idea really, came out because some of our long-term monitoring efforts of bird populations were getting to the point several decades in to where some of the conclusions were becoming very, very clear, and they could start to estimate population trends across almost all bird species, essentially. And this image you're seeing here actually is from the State of the Birds, which is an assessment done every few years on America's birds. This was actually published just last week or a few days ago. The 2025 State of the Birds, you can Google that and check it out online. This is something a figure that has now there's been a few iterations of, and this is the newest iteration of this figure, just looking at the different types of birds and their overall change. Some of these lines go back really solidly all the way, into 1970s and 80s. And you see on the x-axis here, this is a 50-year time scale that we're looking at. And right, you see most of these guilds are below the dotted line. And so on the y-axis here, dotted line is 0, and this is the total percent of population change since 1970. So over long time periods, you see the vast majority of birds are declining. Very few birds of guilds are actually increasing. Water birds and waterfowl, and dabbling ducks and diving ducks in particular, have done much better than other birds. And that's in part because we are good at creating habitat when we have the intention and helping birds. And most waterfowl, of course, are game species and have a different focus for conservation and management. Whereas the species below primarily do not, and these are more these non-game species, and you see massive declines in certain guilds, in particular the eastern forest birds, shorebirds, arid land birds, and grassland birds. These with significant declines across the years. And arid land birds in particular, something that's really important in Nevada, where many of you are located. Massive declines in species reliant on that landscape in Nevada. Shorebirds are reliant on Nevada as well too, and especially during migration when we know that these stopovers are so important for them. But we see shorebirds very different than the other two guilds of waterbirds on this figure, right? The other two guilds of waterbirds are doing pretty well, whereas shorebirds not so much. They're on the opposite end of the scale, and they are searching for different types of food than those other birds. But they're also, their window of habitat that they're looking for is quite narrow compared to some of these other species. And so using a lot of the data that went into that, and then an additional data set, even modeling habitat distributions, recently there was a publication, it's actually 2023 now, it was just focused on shorebirds. I was like, wow, shorebirds are really declining. We need to look at them even closer using long-term monitoring data. So this came out primarily using data from the International Shorebird Survey, which does go back to about to 40 years in many locations, and has really been reliant on community science and volunteers for decades now. So one of the longest running community science efforts in the country. And this is what it's shown us for shorebirds. There have been significant declines. Again, on the y-axis on the left is the percent of total population change. This is from 1980 to 2019. So 40 years here. And you can see we have only 2 species out of, I think, the 30 or so that they estimated here had an estimated increase in populations, those willets and marbled godwits. I'll circle back to them in a minute. But the overall take home here is, especially these longer distance migrants, almost all of the ones on the far left, red knot, Hudsonian godwit, short-billed dowitcher, Dunlins, long-billed dowitcher, whimbrel, these are some of the longest migrating species in the Western Hemisphere, lesser yellow legs. I'm just reading from left to right there. And so I know most of you, these people in person probably can't see that, but we have, of well over 50% decline for half of the species that they looked at. So again, I mentioned this was from the International Shorebird Survey. This paper in particular, and the two images that I've shown you both about declining shorebirds, this is the actual sampling frame and the places where these data have been collected primarily. And there's a pretty clear, difference between the eastern US and the western US. These data are an amazing data set, but they're from a different flyway than we're living. They're not from the Pacific Flyway. There's a couple of sites that have been monitored in the West, but very few overall. So most of these conclusions are based on data from the eastern portion of the North America. So knowing this, back in now 20 years ago, there started to be conversations with Point Blue, and back then we were actually PRBO Conservation Science and many other partners and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and these partnerships that were being built across these large flyways and landscapes, noting that they knew that there was no monitoring effort in the West. And so by 2010, Point Blue had established a monitoring effort for wintering shorebirds, primarily along the coast, called the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey. That quickly grew within a couple of years to the Migratory Shorebird Project, which then extended, and we now have monitoring sites in all 13 countries of the Pacific coast of the Americas. You can see the sites on the white dots on the map there, lining the Pacific coast. We have a few inland sites, but none too far inland, maybe like the Central Valley in California, Willamette Valley in Oregon, where we know that there's concentrations of wintering shorebirds. And so this focuses on when the birds aren't moving, right? We have an ability to get a good snapshot of these populations each winter. And so that was now about 15 years ago. So when we're only doing one survey a year, years are replicate. So it's going to take some years before we can begin to really analyze and have some power to tell a story and with the data. Next slide, please. And so one of the first publications that came out from this was a couple of years ago now. A graduate student down in Northwest Mexico with Eduardo Palacios's lab. They published some trends on these large shorebirds, and you can see the sampling frame up top. This is from California and all the way through Northwest Mexico, which covers the wintering range primarily for these species, at least in the West. And you can see what we found. Willets declining by almost 8% a year, marbled godwits declining by almost 9% a year. So these are significant, even statistically significant declines. Curlews were declining nowhere near to the same extent, so that was actually not a significant statistical result, but the trend was a negative trend for long-billed curlews as well. Notable, though, a couple slides ago for these eastern data over 40 years, we the only two species that were increasing were marbled godwits and willet. We know there's a lot of differences between some of the subpopulations in eastern willet and western willet, but clearly just highlighting the need for monitoring in these areas to really understand what's happening with the populations. Next slide. And so now this is actually in review now. Hopefully we're in a peer-reviewed publication at some point in 2025. We are working with partners to push out the first trends for the Pacific Flyway. And these are from wintering birds. And this is from a 10-year period, but using data from coastal British Columbia all the way to Peru. And this is a little different on the data here, where the change per year is a change per year, and that's on the bottom, the x-axis. Species are up on the y-axis. So 10 years of data are, our error bars are going to be a little bit bigger, but you can see the vast majority of species had negative trends overall. Statistically significant declines include willet, dowitchers, least sandpipers, dunlins, pretty close for curlews, black-bellied plover, and American avocets. And really, American avocet is the one on the bottom that has large error bars, but we're estimating a decline of around 10% per year in American avocets from 2021 to 2020, or sorry, 2012 to 2021. Very significant notable declines too in some of those other species as well. So now we're going to start thinking about the Intermountain West. And this picture of the background image is how we have to work with migratory shorebirds for this is the conservation of sorry, excuse me, the Pacific America's Shorebird Conservation Strategy. So you see these large scale that they have to work on. But there's also a pretty unique area within that, and it's almost all coastal, right? But then you see in the Western United States, we know that there's this really important network of saline lakes and freshwater wetlands that are supporting primarily migrating birds. They're starting to show up there, already in the spring. So super important in spring, and then also in fall for different reasons. Next slide. So we also know that there are a lack of data from this landscape because our wintering program focused primarily on the coast, this landscape being such an important place in the flyway, but yet there's little known about shorebirds today. And we know it's critically important for migration stopovers for so many birds. It's several birds breeding there as well, but especially for the whole suite of shorebirds, it's critically important in migration. And the last real work that was done on shorebirds at the scale of the entire region was by some of my predecessors who led the Pacific Flyway Project back in the late 80s through early 90s. And that really just mapped out shorebirds at a scale that hadn't really been done before, documenting the most important sites at that point, across this portion of the flyway. A lot has changed, right, in 30 years. Like this was just after the wetland policies really started being enacted in the U.S., like the no net loss wetlands, which is something that continues today, although it does, it's hard. They don't have wetland quality is not entirely included in that. But there's also we know that climate change has continued to impact our weather each year, and on both annual and then these multi-annual, multi-decadal scales as into the West. Until the last few years, it's wetter than it has been in quite some time. And we've been estimating wetland distributions across the West and know of these massive declines in water and wetland systems. So next slide, please. So we ventured out on this effort to recreate these old surveys that were done 30 years ago, revisit all of these sites and assess their health using shorebirds. So we went out to document shorebird abundance and diversity at now over 200 sites across 11 Western states. And that's a massive effort. But we can also then tie that to wetland distributions. The Intermountain West Joint Venture has been developing a tool that can process and download and visualize remotely sensed surface water distribution. So we can get a coarse scale look at the amount of water that's on the landscape. And that even goes back all the way to the 80s. The data are a lot more spotty back then, but we still have some images and estimates of wetland distributions from 30 years ago as well. So once we have these two massive data sets, we can then look at these 30-year changes, both in the shorebirds and the wetlands, understand, are shorebirds declining more so than the wetlands, or are they declining, in a similar rate? We also will look into some different human and other ecosystem factors that could be influencing some of those changes. So how are we doing it? We needed to identify our survey windows because we wanted to look at both spring and fall and the northward and southward migrations for these birds. So the Audubon Migration Ecology team took a lot of eBird data and estimated the annual abundance, as you'll see up in the top right there, of these individual species across each week of the year. And we were able to identify two survey windows when it maximized both the diversity and abundance of shorebirds moving through the region. So this is the last week of April, where we had a shorter window for 1 week because we know birds are moving through a lot faster at that time period. And then also and then in the middle of August, essentially the 9th through the 22nd, with a 2-week window there. We know stopover times are a lot longer in that period, so we have a bigger time window to actually get that snapshot, which we're going to do once each season. And as Ned even mentioned, we started back in 2022 in the fall with our first surveys, and now we're planning to survey at least through 2026. And we try to go to these sites to do reasonably complete surveys. Of course, it's not feasible to count every bird at many of these sites, not most of them, especially because wetlands are hard to access. Some sites are massive. But we try to have an effort to do a reasonably complete survey that matches the plan from 30 years ago, as they were trying to go and count all the birds they could. And we're including all shorebird species, and a few sites we do include some other water birds in the surveys as well. Next slide. And to do this, it takes, of course, a massive effort. We didn't start surveys till August 2022, but we started working on building out the network more than a year before that. And then it took us still another year after that before we're completely built out. But we use this combination of observers with amazing volunteers that have skills to identify birds, being a huge portion of the data that's collected, probably almost half. And then we use staff from NGOs like Point Blue and Audubon and Great Basin Bird Observatory that help with many of these surveys as well. And then a lot of agency partner biologists. We call them partner biologists, but these are folks seated in agencies, at states and federal agencies primarily. A few more local agencies participate as well. And so we can have all these different people over this huge scale, over this huge landscape, collect data on birds using the same protocol with collecting the same types of data, and then they can go and enter it online in the Avian Knowledge Network using all the same database and all the same entry portals together. So we have everything centralized despite such a large area that we're covering. Next slide. Lastly, just a couple of other key objectives, and this is, I mentioned identifying the key drivers. We're also establishing a regional framework, and this standardized protocol that has the ability to continue to monitor shorebird populations for decades across the region. We might not need to monitor every site to be able to keep our finger on shorebird populations, but in this first iteration of it, we want to map out all of the sites, and then we can from there pare back as needed. There's also some other efforts that will go on, like understanding Phragmites control, which is a big wetland management action at Great Salt Lake. And then also just at the end, bringing all of the results to the public and then also stakeholders on the ground at many of these sites. Of course, we can't get to them all, but we hope to really deliver in person in a lot of ways. So now I can hand it off to Max.
Yeah, thanks, Blake. And I'm Max Malmquist. I'm the engagement manager with Audubon Saline Lakes program. I'm based in Salt Lake City, and I've been with Audubon for 6.5 years now. And our program's mission is healthy saline lake ecosystems with reliable water supplies to sustain both birds and people. And again, I really appreciate Great Basin Bird Observatory and Audubon for this opportunity to share about our project. And I'm going to now switch gears and provide some information about where we are with the project today, and also some of our preliminary results. And just note that with the data that we're sharing, that it is preliminary, it's uncorrected raw counts. So keep in mind, it's all subject to a QA/QC process, and it's still under review. So some of these numbers might change. So Blake spoke about the historic survey, and with that survey, they published a paper that identified 38 sites as important to shorebirds. And the criteria that they used was the individual site supported 1,000 shorebirds or more on at least one spring or fall survey. So here on the right is a map of those sites from that publication. And to date, over our first 5 seasons of surveys, we've conducted a minimum of baseline surveys at 232 sites in 11 Western states, which of course includes all of those 162 sites that were part of that historic effort. And so as we're starting to kind of go through some of our initial data, keep this map and these important sites in the back of your mind when we start looking at some of these numbers. Okay, so after 5 seasons, we're starting to see some interesting similarities and differences compared to the historic survey. So on this map, the light blue triangles represent sites that held over 1,000 shorebirds in a season in the past and are continuing to do so in our current survey. And all of those 17 sites are listed here on the left to give you an idea of where those places are located. So, we've got a couple sites in Utah, Great Salt Lake, Utah Lake, Lahontan Valley, wetlands in Nevada. You can see a number of sites in California, Goose Lake, Honey Lake, Klamath, Mono Lake, Owens Lake, Salton Sea. In Oregon, Harney Basin, Lake Abert, and Summer Lake. And then in Idaho, American Falls Reservoir, which is also a Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network site. And then the sites that historically supported over 1,000 shorebirds, but are no longer supporting those types of numbers, are shown with darker triangles here. So you can start to see that there's been significant change, at least with our first 5 seasons of data in states like Nevada and California. And then lastly here, the orange circles, they represent sites newly holding over 1,000 shorebirds. So this includes a few sites from the historic survey. Those sites have asterisks next to them. But it also includes a number of sites in places that were not surveyed in the historic survey. So you see quite a few orange circles over kind of in the eastern portion of the interior part of the flyway in Montana and Colorado and Wyoming and New Mexico. And so even though we're partway through this program, you can already start to get a picture of some of the places that we can potentially target as priorities for conservation and for restoration efforts. And as you know, in Nevada, Nevada is the center of the Great Basin. It's the middle of the Intermountain West. It's also the center of our project scope. And Nevada contains more sites than any other Western state. And we really just want to give a big thanks to our many partners who've contributed to this program. Lahontan Audubon Society, Bristlecone Audubon, Red Rock Audubon Society, Great Basin Bird Observatory, Nevada Department of Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service have all been incredible partners in helping us cover so many sites. And a lot of these sites, as you know, you're from Nevada, they're very remote as well. And sticking with the Nevada theme here a little bit, here's some maps showing our data from Nevada during our first 3 fall surveys. And the size of the red dot is in relation to the total shorebirds counted at each site. So a bigger dot means a higher number of birds. And just a couple of things to note here. I helped survey about a dozen or so sites in eastern Nevada in our pilot surveys in August of 2022, so right up in here. And many of those sites were completely dry as a result of the mega drought. I went out there with my dad, and we were chasing mirages, and we were thinking, wow, are there ever going to be birds here again? And then we had a pretty incredible winter in 2023, and a number of those sites bounced back, and all of a sudden they were holding birds again, which I think really shows the importance of adding water back to the landscape. Just another thing to note here with all of these sites in Nevada, you might be looking at this and going, oh, well, a lot of those numbers are pretty low. Well, in reality, it's really important for us to understand how birds use these smaller sites, especially in those years where the bigger, more important sites may be struggling, because that helps us to understand the resiliency and the carrying capacity of wetlands across the region. This graphic provides a unique look at how many sites we surveyed in different states. Of course, you'll note here in August of 2022, we surveyed around 100 sites as we were doing pilot surveys and building the program out. And then in our last 4 seasons of surveys, you can see we've been averaging somewhere around 200 plus sites. And again, just notice the turquoise color for Nevada with all those sites. And then California also has quite a few sites as well. And now if we flip over to total numbers of shorebirds counted during each season, the graphic changes quite a bit. And one of the first things you might notice is the seasonality, or the difference in total numbers between spring and fall migration. And Blake alluded to this, but in the spring, these birds are moving quickly through the region to get to their breeding grounds. Some of these sites have too much water in the spring because of spring runoff. And then on the other side of things, in the fall, many of these birds are staging, they're molting, they're fattening up to prepare for migration. So they're utilizing these habitats and food resources for a longer period of time. And then also, of course, in fall, we get juvenile birds that add to those numbers. And so unlike that previous graph, you'll notice that states like Utah and California and Oregon are supporting significant proportions of the birds that are moving through the region. And I think this is an interesting representation of the distribution of shorebirds, which hopefully will become a little bit clearer for you as to why on the next slide. So this table summarizes counts at 9 saline lake ecosystems during our first 5 seasons, which a lot of times are our largest and most complex, and even historically are some of our most important sites. So here at the top, we have our total number of shorebirds counted across the region and the number of sites surveyed. And then at the bottom here, you'll notice that these 9 ecosystems are supporting 90 to 95% of the birds that we've counted during our first 5 seasons. And so that's very significant. And then you'll notice those highlighted numbers. So all those highlighted numbers represent counts that exceeded the maximum count from the historic survey. So just a few examples. If you look at Great Salt Lake there in last fall, in fall of 2024, we counted over 500,000 shorebirds. And at the peak of the mega drought in 2022, Great Salt Lake was at its historic low. And then we've had a couple of good winters, and the lake had rebounded a bit. And so now we've kind of seen the bird numbers kind of bounce back with the rebounding of the lake. Also, kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum, Salton Sea. So Salton Sea has continued to steadily decline, and the lake level continues to drop. And we're starting to see the ecosystem change, the types of food that's available change. There's a lot more exposed lake bed, and then the freshwater inputs that largely are coming from irrigated agriculture and runoff, they're creating a lot of wetted mudflat. And so, where in the past, the Salton Sea has supported it supported a fishery, supported a lot of pisciferous birds. In the fall of 2023, we had over 250,000 shorebirds, and they were largely small calidraous sandpiper. And then another unique example, if you look here at Owens Lake, many of you may know Owens Lake in the 1900s Owens River was diverted to help support the population growth of the city of Los Angeles. And Owens Lake completely dried up. And that lake bed became one of the largest emitters of particulate matter in the country. And as a result, LA Department of Water and Power has spent billions of dollars to mitigate that dust. And they do that in several different ways, through gravel and planting shrubs, but they've also created a lot of shallow wetland habitat for dust suppression. And you can see that Owens Lake, every season that we have counted to date, has exceeded the maximum from the historic count. And those historic surveys were done before all the dust mitigation was taking place at Owens Lake, and it was in a pretty bad place. You'll also note, kind of interesting, Owens Lake it's important in the spring as well. So if you look at spring of 2024, Owens Lake actually hosted more birds than at Great Salt Lake, even though it is significantly smaller site. We also wanted to provide an example of species-specific information that we can draw from this data. So here we have snowy plover numbers from across the region at 8 key sites. And as we're seeing changes in lake level and exposed lake bed or playa at places like Great Salt Lake and Salton Sea, we're seeing some interesting numbers exceeding the historic maximum counts. And again, this table really reflects the importance of these locations for this particular species. You can see anywhere from 95+%, almost 100% in spring of 2024 of the snowy plovers were counted at these sites. And of course, look, depending on what species you're looking at, say for example, Western sandpiper or long-billed dowitcher, which lots move through Nevada, the kind of makeup of those sites that are important to the individual species can shift or change a little bit. So just to give you an idea of our project timeline, Blake mentioned, 2021, 2022, early days in the project, we really spent that time building up our partnership network and building out the program framework. And of course, we conducted our pilot surveys in August of 2022. And so now the last couple of years, we're really into that data collection phase. We're of course continuing to conduct surveys into 2026, but we're also starting to move into our science and delivery phase of the program. And as part of our science and delivery phase, we're starting to plan for products on the back end and really thinking critically about how the data and information and the analyses that we can do can make the most impact to support shorebird conservation. So these types of things include reports to state and federal agencies. We have a master's student who's doing a thesis at Utah State University who's going to be working with us. And ultimately, we hope to have multiple peer-reviewed publications. And we want this data and analyses to inform wetland management and policy decisions. So we will be looking to present at conferences to stakeholders, agencies. Hopefully we can host some webinars like this one to keep our network informed. And as all of these products come together, we'll ensure to provide up-to-date information on our new project website. And so many of you who are involved in these surveys have probably seen this in our most recent email blast, but over the winter, we're really excited to announce that we have a new website that is basically a one-stop shop for the Intermountain West Shorebird surveys. On the website, we have a number of pages that include up-to-date news, so articles and blogs. We have a surveyor resources page that has downloadable data sheets and protocols. We'll have recordings for trainings. We'll include these the recording for tonight in there as well. Also materials for practicing identification and counting techniques. And then we do have a gallery, which is a page dedicated to pictures to highlight all of the folks that are out in the field conducting surveys. So if you do participate and you go out in the field and count shorebirds, make sure to share your photos with me. You know, attach your name, where it was that you were surveying, and we'll make sure to get those onto the website. We are always looking for additional folks who are interested in participating, and we have a wonderful cohort of volunteers across the West, but not everyone is available every season. So if you'd like to volunteer, please sign up on our website. We'll also make sure here towards the end to put a link in the chat for the Google form to sign up for this April. And just a few places we wanted to highlight. We still need a few pairs of eyes at Lahontan Valley this April. Lahontan Audubon Society has been wonderful. We're actually conducting additional surveys at this site because it is one of Audubon's priority locations. So if you're interested in helping at Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge, let us know. And also in talking to the chapter, if you just want to dip your toes in a little bit and see what it's like to survey, and maybe you're not comfortable enough yet to be a survey lead. There might be some opportunities to join an existing team, help record data. Maybe you can drive the team to the site. And then just some other places where we could use some extra help. There's some very remote sites in Northwest Nevada. Got a handful of sites in Southern Nevada and along the Colorado River where we could still use some help. Eastern California. And then we can always use some extra eyes at some of our large complex sites like Salton Sea, Great Salt Lake, and Mona Lake. And finally here, we want to thank our key partners who've helped fund and make this program possible. This includes a number of state agencies and nonprofit organizations that have contributed, staff time and capacity to this program. But really also Fish and Wildlife Service, they helped fund the first 2 years of this program, and really want to thank them for their contributions. And then also, we really want to thank all the Audubon chapters, the tribes, private landowners, all the other people that have really made this work possible. Our network includes almost 100 organizations across the West, and we wouldn't be where we are today without each and every one of you. So thank you so much. And we really hope that you consider contributing to this project as we move forward in 2025. And with that, we will turn it over. I don't know how much time we have, Ned, for questions, but happy to answer a couple if it works.
Yeah, great. Thanks, guys. So far, no questions have been coming through, but we'll give folks another minute. And if anyone here in person has any questions, you should be able to just holler and this thing should pick you up.
To sign up for the survey, do we email you, Max?
So you can go to our website, imwss.org. I think it's actually on the calendar invite for this presentation as well. I think Ned put it in there for the description. And right away on the entry page, it should say sign up for April surveys. I also, Ned, I put in the chat, Blake said we're not allowed to communicate with the public, but I put a link to our Google sign up form in there if you want to share that with folks.
I just want to say, if you're in Lahontan Audubon Society, that sign up sheet that Max just mentioned, that's going to go out in the email.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Ann.
Sorry, guys, I'm not sure what I did with the chat settings. I have the ability to change who sees my chat messages, but I guess you guys don't have that option.
Yeah, I think we can only see you and Lauren.
Oh yeah, there does seem to be something with the chat. Okay. Well, it seems that everyone on the webinar might not be able to access the chat. Oh no, there you go. I see a message from Blake to all panelists. Blake figured it out. Oh no, all panelists isn't what we want.
Yeah, I'm not so sure everyone can see that, but maybe if you can copy what I put in there, then maybe everyone can. I'm not sure if you have different.
Also looks like I can't.
Well, and Ned, I'll just mention, Blake and I are always welcome to questions. We've got our emails up here, and if you have any questions or follow up, feel free to reach out to us at any time.
Yeah, thanks, guys. It looks like I did some there's the chat does seem to be disabled for attendees. I'm not sure what's going on and I can't find that setting. So I apologize about that. But you can reach out at least to outreach@gbbo.org and I'll get you in touch with Blake and Max.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
All right, well, if there are no more questions for Max and Blake, I'm going to let Lauren jump on for the ID portion of the webinar.